Welcome to the plenary session of day two of our conference. Uh, Today we have with us Dr. Azfar Hussain. Professor Dr. Azfar Hussain is a bilingual writer, critic, poet, translator, currently serving as the director of the graduate program in social innovation at Grand Valley State University, Michigan. He is also the vice president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies, GCAS, in New York, and holds the position of GCAS Professor of English, World Literature, and Interdisciplinary Studies. He is also a summer distinguished professor of English and Humanities at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. Professor Hussain has taught English, world literature, ethnic studies, and cultural studies at several U.S. institutions, including Washington State University, Bowling Green State University, and Oklahoma State University. In Bangladesh, he has taught at Jahangirnagar University and North South University. In addition to authoring and editing several books, Hussain has published hundreds of academic, creative, and popular works in both English and Bengali. His scholarship spans a wide range of topics from Native American poetics to Marxist political economy, critics of postmodern and postcolonial theory, third world literatures, imperialism, and the theories and practices of interdisciplinarity. His works also include transnationals, translations from multiple non-Western languages. Dr. Azfar Hussain is going to deliver his plenary speech on From Words to Worlds, Translation as Transnational Praxis. So with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Azfar Hussain to deliver his plenary speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Son. Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you?
Yes, sir,
Can everybody hear me? Okay, so it's great. Thank you for that kind introduction, and greetings from Michigan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And let me also thank Professor Arifur Rahman, Chair of ULab's English Department, and Dr. Rofi Saleh, the driving force behind this international conference, for inviting me to speak at ULab today or tonight. Well, while it's morning for most of you here in Michigan, it's afternoon for most of you. Here it's in Michigan, it's well past 11 o'clock at night. But, when I keep thinking of time, I keep thinking of Dante and his, pronouncement on different temporal dimensions, which is in Italian, it's a very musical line from Dante, the medieval Italian epic poet. Il ponto a cui tutti li tempi son presenti, which means, actually, T.S. Eliot, in fact, appropriated Dante in his work, in his long poem, 4 quartets there. It means actually time past and time future are all contained within time present. So I'm experiencing that kind of temporality, if you will. But it's a pleasure to be part of this gathering, even across time zones. So the title of my talk is From Words to Worlds, Translation as Transnational Praxis. And this topic, translation as a transformative world-making practice, is one I have been deeply invested in for a long time. At its core, translation operates at the intersection of what I wish to call the worlding of the word and the wording of the world, capturing a dynamic and dialectical process. This is, of course, only one of the many roles translation plays, but it is one I find particularly fascinating. So what I will share with you today is but a slice of a much larger project I'm working on around translation. And owing to time constraints, I'll have to skip over some detailed examples, but I hope to convey the essence of my arguments and ideas as clearly as I can. So translation matters. The hard materiality of translation is proven in, among other things, of course, in what is called mistranslation, a form of translation, nevertheless, that might cause that might cause damage or destruction or even death or confusion or amusement. And here is one story, real or cooked up, you know, a story of mistranslation, but the story has a point to make, regardless of its, genesis or mode of being in the world. So here is the story. When KFC, short for Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is a global fast food restaurant chain specializing in fried chicken, first opened in China, their famous slogan, "Finger licking good," was mistranslated as "eat your fingers off." Talk about a commitment to good flavor. And there is another China story having to do with the Pepsi slogan blunder. When Pepsi launched in China, they translated their slogan, "Pepsi brings you back to life." However, the Chinese translation accidentally promised, and I quote, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave," unquote. So there is a little more resurrection than most people expected with their soft drink. So these little blunders highlight the real art and skill of translation. Words alone aren't enough. The meaning, context, and nuances are what make it all work. And if not, well, at least we get a good laugh. Or seriously speaking, we might even die. Indeed, translation matters in commerce and in capital, in empire, in conflict and in confrontation, and in resistance too. And of course, translation matters in love, where, as Shakespeare dramatizes it in a number of his romantic comedies, language alternates between silence and translation. In his latest book called The Language of Languages, Reflections on Translation, a book that appeared just last year, the Kenyan novelist, playwright, theorist, translator, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, my good comrade as well, just can't help saying that. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o mobilizes an instructive reading of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' theory of what they call the language of real life, to suggest that, and I quote Ngugi here, the humanization of nature is itself a process of translation in the makeup of our human community. Indeed, like language itself, like money, like God, translation is power and it is everywhere, although people's access to it is by no means asymmetrical or equal or even open. As the British comparatist and translation theorist Matthew Reynolds tells us in his 2016 book on translation, and I quote Reynolds here, not only does translation give us foreign news, dubbed films, and instructions for the microwave, but without translation, there would be no world religions, while without it, our literatures, our cultures, and even languages would be unrecognizable. So the Cervantes and Garcia Marquez translator, Edith Grossman's 2010 book called Why Translation Matters, along with the newly released book, The Philosophy of Translation. It just came out a couple of months back, and I couldn't resist the temptation of reading it. In fact, I read it overnight, quite a book. So along with this, this Philosophy of Translation, a fascinating book by Damien Searles, who is a famous translator of Proust and Wittgenstein. These two books passionately, ardently accentuate the profound significance of translation. These two books underline and underwrite translation's critical role across linguistic, artistic, philosophical, hermeneutic, heuristic, pedagogical, and practical domains all at once, underscoring how translation shapes and enriches our understanding on multiple levels simultaneously. And I concur with Searle's contention that translation is creative as well. As he maintains, and I quote Searles here, a translator is not just a copyist trying to replicate the original as closely as possible. A translator is necessarily producing new work in and for a new context, unquote. Searles is, of course, influenced by none other than the great translation theorist, the German Marxist cultural critic, Walter Benjamin, in English, Walter Benjamin. Let me then quote from Benjamin's famous essay called The Task of the Translator. So I quote Benjamin, it is the task of the translator to release in his own language, that pure language that is under the spell of another, to liberate the language imprisoned in a work in his recreation of that work, unquote. So, according to Benjamin, translation is, among other things, recreation. Translation also de-imprisons. Translation liberates. And translation under certain material circumstances can be significantly most graphic too. And here I'm reminded of the literary critic George Steiner's, magisterial 1970-75 work called After Babel, Some Aspects of Language and Translation, a work famous for making such pronouncements as, I quote George Steiner here, to understand is to decipher, to hear significance is to translate, unquote. Invoking Hegel and Heidegger, Steiner suggests that being must engage other being to achieve self-definition in the world, and that, I quote Steiner again, existence in history, the claim to recognize identity and style are based on relations to other articulate constructs. Of such relations, translation is the most graphic, unquote. In fact, Steiner contests all conventional or certain conventional, theories of translation by maintaining that all human communication within and between languages is translation. One can surely go on and on accounting for the significance of translation, but numerous definitional adventures notwithstanding, that age-old question persistently returns to the stage of history. What is translation after all? Translation, a term with a rich etymological history, has evolved through layers of linguistic influence, although, as Matthew Reynolds convincingly tells us, and I quote him again, there is no exact translation of translation, unquote. Let me quickly trace its etymological history then. The English word translation derives from the Latin translatio. Translatio, a fusion of trans, meaning across, and ferre, to carry or to bear, originally meaning a carrying across or a transferring. The verb transferre, from which we also get transfer, meant moving something from one place to another. In language, this became the act of carrying meaning from one language to another. In medieval Latin, translatio, Translatio, translatio took on a more specific linguistic sense. It came to signify the rendering of words from one language to another, encompassing both the physical movement and the metaphorical transfer of meaning. Then we see the old French influence, and by the 14th century, the term entered English as translation, with the same dual meanings, physical movement and the translation of texts. Finally, by the Middle English period, translation gained a more specialized focus on rendering texts between languages, solidifying the core sense we rely on today, carrying meaning across the boundaries, across the borders of language. Thus, the evolution of translation has always had connotations of movement, whether physical or intellectual, emphasizing the process of carrying something, meaning ideas and meanings themselves, or words and whatever, from one domain to another. Now I will enter the second stream of my talk. So in the formulation of the 18th century German linguist and philosopher Wilhelm von Humboldt, in German pronunciation, Humboldt in English, Humboldt, was a translator of Xenophon and Pindar and Aeschylus, and widely regarded as a predecessor to Noam Chomsky's modern generative linguistics as well. So in his formulation, translation, like language itself, is not merely ergon or a product, but energia, an activity, encompassing both movement and transfer. With the emergence of what Goethe and later Karl Marx called world literature back in the 19th century, translation also came to imply travel, often transnational in nature. In fact, it is primarily translation which made world literature and comparative literature possible. And that was, one of the arguments of also Susan Basnet, who actually delivered a talk, I think the keynote speech last week at City University, where I also had the opportunity of, giving a lecture on comparative literature and political economy. So that was another thing, another topic. But yes, translation made world literature and comparative literature possible. It is not for nothing that the Portuguese novelist Jose Saramago once maintained, and I quote him, "Writers make national literature, while translators make universal literature." So we have translators here in the audience. Of course, Arifa translates, Shamsa translates, I see. I don't know if Ghulam Jilani translates though. So, you see something here, I'm celebrating your work, your roles in the world, your mode of being in the world, actually. Do you see that? Where is Arifa? Arifa is not here though. Anyway, so, and then the Italian novelist Italo Calvino, puts it this way, and I quote Calvino, "The translator, my most important ally, introduces me to the world," unquote. But here is an interesting story. And this is an interesting story of transnational travel way prior to even Goethe's first use of Weltliteratur, meaning world literature. So I have been reading the 14th century Italian storyteller Giovanni Boccaccio since my undergraduate days. I think his monumental work called The Decameron, as a collection of wide-ranging tales, was a massive event in what might be called, a la the French sociologist and theorist Pierre Bourdieu, the French literary critic Pascal Casanova, and the American sociologist Emmanuel Wallerstein, the world system of literary productions. So I find it significant that Boccaccio drew not only on a number of tales from the Arabian Nights, but also on other sources from India and Iran, for instance. In fact, the range of sources Boccaccio drew from was simply staggering. In some ways, or in its own ways, thus the Decameron is planetary. And then, of course, there is this question of what is called the frame story that Boccaccio famously used, which, however, was neither his own invention nor a European one, for the frame story came from the 3rd century BCE Sanskrit work called Panchatantra, a collection of animal fables in prose and poetry, a work that was available in Italian, Greek, and Latin translations during the European medieval period. I should also note that the Panchatantra was already available in the Arab world before it reached Europe. It was translated into Arabic by Ibn al-Muqaffa around the year 750 under the Arabic title Kalila wa Dimna. I think Abdullah Al-Mahmoud knows Arabic. So I hope I'm pronouncing this, Arabic title correctly. Kalila wa Dimna. Am I correct? Mahmoud? Okay, Mahmoud is not here either. Anyways, so mark them this fascinating transnational, transtemporal, transspatial, translational travel. It's quite some alliteration also, and trans phenomenon as well. So Boccaccio encountered the Panchatantra through a Latin translation, but that Latin translation was based on a Hebrew translation, and that Hebrew translation was itself based on an Arabic version, and that Arabic version in turn was based on a Persian one. So quite the transnational, transspatial route, isn't it? Now, was everything lost along the way because they have translation of translation of translation and so on and so forth? Was everything lost along the way? Absolutely not. On the contrary, Europe gained immensely through this process, as Boccaccio himself might attest. Salman Rushdie once put it this way, although I'm not very crazy about Salman Rushdie's current politics, pro-imperial politics. So yeah, once put it this way, Salman Rushdie, if something is lost in translation, something is also gained in translation, unquote. This layered transspatial cross-cultural transmission is a testament to the richness and vitality of translation as a creative act. In other words, the Decameron exemplifies a kind of planetary intertextuality, making the point that stories in translation travel across the world way faster than human beings do. I would rather frame it this way: translation gives wings to stories, texts, words, enabling them to cross borders and boundaries. And in doing so, it enacts the dialectics of worlding the words, forging meaningful, rewarding, and sometimes even startling connections across diverse sites and subjects. But then we live in a world where these diverse sites and subjects are not equal, where connections themselves become unequal connections or unequal exchanges, a world characterized by not only what Michel Foucault once called the microphysics of power, but also the macrophysics of unequal power relations that characterize what we have come to call globalization today, which, according to the Egyptian political economist Samir Amin, is a euphemism for the latest stage of capitalism itself. So, in this context, the French cultural critic Pascal Casanova introduces the concept of what she terms, this is her phrase, term, translation as unequal exchange, in a groundbreaking book called The World Republic of Letters. Originally published in 1999, of course, in French, the English translation followed in 2007, bringing her influential ideas to a broader audience. Casanova also mobilizes the concept of a world system of literary productions, which, according to her, is, I quote Pascal Casanova here, characterized by the opposition between the great national spaces, which are also the oldest and accordingly the best endowed, and those literary spaces that have more recently appeared that are poor by comparison, unquote. So Casanova's formulation is informed and inflected by French theorist and sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's concept of the literary field. Bourdieu describes the field as a space marked by political, economic, and cultural forces where various forms and practices compete for what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital, a form of cultural prestige or value. This competition, according to Bourdieu, establishes a global hierarchy, positioning dominating literatures above their dominated counterparts. In fact, there are others who use both Bourdieu and Casanova, as I myself do, to examine this world system of literary productions that refers to the interconnected network of literary creations and translations circulation, and reception across the globe, often viewed through a lens that demystifies and spotlights unequal power relations between different regions, with certain core nations exerting significant influence over literary norms and value, while peripheral regions are often seen as importers and adapters of literary forms produced elsewhere, similar to the economic world system concept theorized by the American sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein. In other words, while literary translations may possess both aesthetic and use values, their exchange value depends on market access, a privilege that is far from equally distributed within this so-called free market economy, which is paradoxically just another euphemism for capitalism. This fact is certainly an obstacle to translation as transnational praxis. So I will return to the question of the political economy of translation in more detail later, but let me now take up the question of translation as transnational praxis. It is in this context that I need to call attention to a particular trinity of intellectual interventions in the field of translation studies and translation theory, interventions made by Lawrence Venuti, one of the major translation theorists working today. His influential works, such as number one, The Translator's Invisibility, number two, The Scandals of Translation, and number three, Translation Changes Everything, can be connected through their shared focus on what I myself call translation as a praxis that is ethical, cultural, and political, rather than merely a technical or linguistic exercise. Together, they accentuate the transformative power of translation and an active engagement with the cultural, ethical, and political dimensions of this practice. So, in the book, The Translator's Invisibility, Venuti mobilizes a powerful critique of the marginalization of translators in the dominant practice of invisible, within quotation marks, with an invisible translation, where fluency erases the translator's interpretive role. This call for visibility aligns with the book called Scandals of Translation, which positions the translator as an ethical mediator, actively negotiating cultural differences rather than homogenizing them. By advocating for foreignizing strategies that retain the distinctiveness of the source culture, Venuti emphasizes the translator's agency as a cultural bridge builder. These ideas converge in his book, another book called Translation Changes Everything, where Venuti underscores translation as a praxis that reshapes cultural flows and challenges dominant power structures. So the synthesis of Venuti's ideas actually highlights translation not merely as a tool for transferring meaning between languages, but as a critical, transspatial act of cultural mediation and resistance, an argument that powerfully aligns with some of the broader decolonial and global frameworks. In summary, viewing translation as a transnational praxis shifts our understanding of it from a mere linguistic exercise to a complex, ethically informed act of intercultural exchange. It encourages translators to engage thoughtfully with the cultural, social, and political dimensions of their work. True, Venuti, from his liberal humanist position, commendably pays attention to the question of the politics of translation, if not its political economy. While he seems to be relatively silent regarding the questions of linguistic imperialism and cultural imperialism, historically produced configurations of unequal power relations that are by no means dead in the post-pandemic global conjuncture, configurations that continue to affect one way or another the circulation, exchange, consumption, and distribution of literary and cultural productions, translations included. In fact, the literary, the cultural, and the translational are profoundly interconnected or even interspliced, such that the borders and boundaries among them begin to blur or even dissolve, given that literary translation itself becomes part of literature, while of course literature itself is always subsumed under the category of culture in the Raymond Williamsian sense of the term. So these are precisely some of the issues and concerns that Ngugi wa Thiong'o recently brought up in his latest book, one that I already mentioned. The title of this book is The Language of Languages, Reflections on Translation. In fact, Ngugi enacts a dialectic of what I wish to call strategic binarism by even putting bluntly towards the beginning of his book, thus, and I quote Ngugi here, there are two ways by which different languages, there are two ways by which different languages and cultures relate to one another. This is Ngugi. Ngugi as hierarchies of unequal power relations, which is the imperial way, or as a network of equal give and take, the democratic way, unquote, while also suggesting that, I quote Ngugi again here, the imperial logic has been the dominant one in the relationship between languages, unquote. Historically and otherwise, this has indeed been the case. Indeed, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is far from being a simple binarist, though. As I've already pointed out, he is a strategic one. At the same time, he remains keenly aware of the over-determined and over-determining complexities surrounding the language question, zeroing in on how imperial logic or reason has been internalized by the natives themselves. In the context of Bangladesh, the issue extends far beyond the tensions between English and Bangla. Consider the many marginalized indigenous, tribal, and minority languages spoken across the country. In fact, Mandi, Chakma, Mro, Shautal, Laleng, Khachi, Hajong, Koch, Dalu, Bishnupriya, Manipuri, Meitei Manipuri, Lushai, Kora, Koda, Munda, Kharia, Mahali, Myanmar, Rakhine, Tripura, Pankho, Gonjushing, Bhumijo, Mahato, Pahadia, Khiang, Kumi, Munda, and Bom. Children are told every day by the state that their mother tongue is Bangla. Bangla? Hell no. Have there been what Ngugi calls networks of equal give and take in terms of translation between Bangla and other marginalized languages in the country? Very little, if any. And this absence itself constitutes a form of violence, one that Ngugi highlights when discussing this quasi-Kantian imperial reason, an ideology that translates into hegemony in precisely the Gramscian sense. In this post-July uprising conjuncture, in times of state reform and restructuring, I think it is imperative to rethink the state through the lens of the language question as well, among, of course, many other things. Doing so is essential if we are to avoid what could be, I think, aptly termed linguistic fascism. And Ngugi himself charts certain contours of linguistic fascism itself, although he does not directly deploy the term. Mark what he says, and I quote Ngugi again. Arranged in a hierarchy of unequal power relationships, the imperial way, languages produce catastrophe, monolingualism, setting itself on top of the hierarchy, suffocates and subordinates languages and cultures. But arranged in a network of equal give and take, the democratic way, languages give life to each other. To sum up, monolingualism is the carbon monoxide of cultures, while multilingualism is the oxygen, unquote. And then defining translation as the language of languages, the common language of languages, that is to say. Ngugi emphatically maintains, and I quote him again, translation is one of the means by which languages and cultures do and can give life to each other. They enable the network of equal give and take, the democratic way, unquote. But I argue that you cannot establish this genuinely democratic way without unsettling and even dismantling both the micrologics and macrologics of capital that brutally, even scandalously morph creative works, including works of translations, into exchange values, into mere commodities, of which Shakespeare, can you believe this, even back in the 17th century, was quite aware. Mark then some of Shakespeare's lines from his play called King John. This is my recent discovery. I didn't know that Shakespeare wrote these lines. This is great. Mad, and I'm quoting Shakespeare from King John. Mad world, mad kings, mad composition. Mad composition. Our, what is it called? The interim government sometimes appears to be a mad composition, sometimes to me. Mad composition, that smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity. Mark this sentence. It's a powerful sentence. Shakespeare is talking about commodity, anticipating Karl Marx. And it's not for nothing that Karl Marx had tremendous love for Shakespeare's work. In fact, Karl Marx has a chapter in his work, early work, called Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. And in that particular chapter, Karl Marx, and the chapter is called The Power of Money in a Bourgeois Society. Karl Marx, in fact, quotes Shakespeare at some length on this money, particularly from Shakespeare's play called The Timon of Athens. Karl Marx quotes at some length from Shakespeare. And by the way, I just can't help saying this, though, sharing this. I mean, Karl Marx's The Power of Money is probably the best thing on money I have ever read in my entire life. And also, this particular chapter reads like a Baudelairean prose poem. It's like a prose poem, like a poem, and he deploys metaphors and, of course, images of all kinds. And there's one particular implication imagistically rendered in this chapter, The Power of Money and Bourgeois Society, an image that suggests that the power of money can make a person's, mouth kiss his own ass, which is impossible. But then, that's what Shakespeare talks about in The Timon of Athens, and so does Marx in The Power of Money and Bourgeois Society. It makes this impossible, and the impossible possible. So mad world, talking about commodity, mad world, that smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity, the bias of the world who of itself is poised to, make to run even upon even ground, till this advantage, this wild drawing bias, this sway of motion, this commodity makes it take head from all indifferency, from all direction, purpose, codes, intent. And this same bias, this commodity, this board, this broker, this all-changing world. One can add world. So anyways, I think I have taken more than 40 minutes here. So let me end with a short poem, very short poem called Translation by none other than the Mexican poet, Octavio Paz. I think Paz celebrates translation as a creative and transformative act, emphasizing its power to connect cultures while honoring their differences. His work resonates deeply with the idea of translation as praxis. And here it goes. Again, it's called just translation. To translate is to write, but to rewrite the world anew. A mirror-turned mosaic, where shards of one life reflect another. Not fidelity, but fire. Not replication, but rebirth. Words crossing borders, nations in the ink. Translation, the art of encounter, the song of difference, a bridge in motion. Thank you.